One morning, I opened my front door to find a bright orange notice nailed to my porch, ***, demolition scheduled. My heart dropped. I'd heard stories about HOAs going too far, but I never imagined they'd target my home. Within hours, strangers in hard hats were measuring my property, neighbors were whispering, and the board president was circling like a vulture. I tried to reason, but every call went unanswered. How could a simple disagreement turn into a threat to destroy everything I'd built? And what would you do if your own home was suddenly on the line? Before the chaos, my life in Maplewood Estates was the kind of quiet I'd always dreamed of. I moved here with my wife, Sarah, and our 10-year-old son, Ethan, hoping for a fresh start after years of city noise and cramped apartments. Our house wasn't fancy, but it was ours. A single-story, sun-washed home with a wide porch, a little vegetable patch, and a backyard where Ethan could play soccer until the fireflies came out. Every morning, I'd step outside with a mug of coffee, breathing in the scent of cut grass and blooming lilacs, waving to neighbors as they walked their dogs or watered their lawns. It felt safe, predictable, and just a little bit idyllic. Sarah loved the community too. She joined the local book club, hosted weekend barbecues, and decorated our porch with hanging baskets every spring. Ethan made friends fast, his laughter echoing down the block as he raced his bike with the other kids. We planted a row of young maple trees along the side of our yard, hoping they'd grow tall enough to shade the house in summer. It was the kind of place where people borrowed sugar, shared garden tools, and looked out for each other. But even in a place like Maplewood Estates, there were rules. The HOA sent out monthly newsletters, reminders about trash pickup, lawn care, and the approved paint colors for front doors. Most of it seemed harmless, just part of keeping the neighborhood tidy. I'd heard a few grumbles from neighbors about the board being strict, but I figured as long as we kept our yard neat and didn't make waves, we'd be fine. Still, there were signs that not everyone saw things the same way. The HOA president, Mr. Granger, was a retired engineer with a reputation for being meticulous, some said obsessive. He walked the neighborhood every morning, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes about overgrown hedges or unauthorized decorations. Some neighbors joked that he measured grass with a ruler. Others avoided him altogether, lowering their voices when he passed by. I didn't think much of it at first. We paid our dues, kept our lawn trimmed, and followed the rules. But then one afternoon I noticed a bright yellow flag staked in our front yard. It was small, almost easy to miss, but it was there, right next to the maple saplings we'd planted. I bent down to read it. Property line dispute pending review. My stomach tightened. I hadn't heard anything about a dispute, and our trees were well within what I thought was our boundary. That evening I mentioned it to Sarah. She frowned, saying she'd seen Mr. Granger packing along the edge of our yard earlier, measuring tape in hand. He didn't say anything to me, she said, but he looked annoyed. We shrugged it off, thinking it was probably a misunderstanding. But the next day, a letter arrived from the HOA, citing us for encroachment and demanding we remove the trees or face escalating fines. It felt surreal. Our peaceful routine was suddenly interrupted by official warnings and veiled threats. I tried to talk to Mr. Granger, but he brushed me off, insisting the board had clear evidence and that the matter was out of his hands. Neighbors started to keep their distance, some offering sympathetic glances, others avoiding eye contact altogether. The sense of community that once felt so strong now seemed fragile, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. I spent evenings poring over property maps and old survey documents, trying to prove the trees were on our land. Sarah grew anxious, worried about what might happen if we pushed back. Ethan asked why the neighbors weren't coming over to play anymore. The tension in our home grew with every new letter, every new threat. It was as if the ground beneath us was shifting, and we had no idea where we stood. Looking back, I realized that was the moment everything changed. The warning flags, the cold stares, the sudden isolation, it was all just the beginning. We were about to find out just how far the HOA would go to enforce their rules and how much we were willing to risk to protect our home. The days after that first letter felt like living under a microscope. Every time I stepped outside, I caught glimpses of Mr. Granger, the HOA president, walking past our house, his eyes narrowed, clipboard in hand. It was as if our home had become his personal project. The yellow flag by our maple trees was soon joined by a second, then a third, each one marking a new violation. One flagged a garden hose left coiled by the porch. Another pointed to a bird feeder Sarah had hung for Ethan to watch the finches. Each flag felt like a warning shot, a reminder that we were being watched. The letters kept coming, each more severe than the last. The first was a friendly reminder to remove the trees. The next was a formal notice, citing us for encroachment and unauthorized landscaping. Then came the fines, $100, then $250, then $500, each one stacking up like bricks in a wall. The language grew harsher, threatening legal action and remediation at the homeowner's expense. I tried to reason with the board, sending emails, making phone calls, even showing up at the monthly meeting with property maps and survey documents, but every attempt was met with the same cold response. The board has reviewed the evidence. The decision stands. Sarah tried to keep our spirits up, but the stress was wearing on her. She stopped going to book club, worried that the other women were talking about us behind our backs. Ethan grew quiet, spending more time in his room, his soccer ball gathering dust in the corner. The friends who used to come over for backyard games now crossed the street to avoid our house. The sense of isolation was suffocating. One afternoon, I came home to find a crew of landscapers in our yard. They were measuring the distance from the trees to the property line, snapping photos, and marking the grass with spray paint. I confronted them, demanding to know who had sent them. One of the workers handed me a work order signed by the HOA. "We're just following instructions," he said, not meeting my eyes. I called Mr. Granger furious, but he simply told me that the board was documenting the extent of the violation and that further action may be necessary. That night, Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by letters, maps, and bills. The fines had reached $1,000, and the latest notice threatened that if we didn't remove the trees within 7 days, the HOA would initiate removal and bill all costs to the homeowner. The threat was clear: comply or they would take matters into their own hands. I started to feel desperate. I called a local surveyor, hoping to get an independent assessment of our property line. He came out the next day, spent hours measuring and checking records, and finally confirmed what I'd suspected all along: the trees were on our land. Armed with his report, I went back to the board, certain that this would end the dispute. But at the next meeting, Mr. Granger dismissed the surveyor's findings, claiming the HOA's own records superseded any outside opinion. The other board members nodded in agreement, their faces blank and unreadable. The pressure kept mounting. The HOA began sending out newsletters with thinly veiled references to problem properties and homeowners who refused to follow the rules. Neighbors stopped waving. Some even started posting passive-aggressive notes on our mailbox. Some people think they're above the rules. The sense of community that had once made Maplewood Estates feel like home was gone, replaced by suspicion and fear. Then one morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery outside. I rushed to the window and saw a backhoe parked at the curb, a crew of workers unloading tools and orange safety cones. My heart pounded as I ran outside, demanding to know what they were doing. The foreman handed me a copy of an emergency remediation order from the HOA, authorizing them to remove unauthorized landscaping and restore property lines. I stood between the workers and the trees, refusing to move. They hesitated, unsure, until Mr. Granger himself arrived, clipboard in hand, insisting that I was obstructing official HOA business and threatening to call the police. Sarah came outside, her face pale, clutching Ethan's hand. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, watching the standoff unfold. Some looked away, others whispered, a few even filmed on their phones. I felt exposed, humiliated, but I refused to back down. I told Mr. Granger that I had proof the trees were on our property, that I would call the police myself if they tried to touch them. He sneered, telling me that the board's authority is final and that further resistance would result in legal action. The workers eventually packed up and left, but the damage was done. The next day, we received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, threatening a lawsuit for obstruction and noncompliance. The fines now totaled over $2,000, and the board warned that they would place a lien on our home if we didn't pay. The stress was overwhelming. Sarah cried herself to sleep. Ethan asked if we were going to lose our house. I felt powerless, trapped in a nightmare with no way out, but I wasn't ready to give up. I started researching HOA laws, reading everything I could find about homeowners' rights and board overreach. I found online forums filled with stories like ours, families bullied by their HOAs, threatened with fines, liens, even foreclosure. Some had fought back and won. Others had lost everything. The more I read, the angrier I became. I realized that we weren't alone and that maybe, just maybe, we could fight back. I reached out to a local attorney who specialized in property disputes. She listened to our story, reviewed the surveyor's report, and agreed to take our case. She sent a formal letter to the HOA demanding that they cease all actions until the property line could be verified by a neutral third party. The board responded with more threats, but for the first time, I felt like we had a chance. The legal battle dragged on for weeks. The HOA refused to back down, insisting that their records were correct and that we were deliberately undermining community standards. They sent more letters, more fines, more threats. The stress took its toll. Sarah lost weight, Ethan's grades slipped, and I found myself snapping at everyone, my patience worn thin. But then a break came. The attorney discovered that the HOA's property maps were outdated, based on an old survey that didn't match the county's official records. She filed a motion to force the board to produce all documentation, and when they did, it became clear that their case was built on shaky ground. The county surveyor confirmed that our trees were, in fact, on our property and that the HOA had no legal right to demand their removal. We presented the evidence at the next board meeting, this time with the county surveyor in attendance. Mr. Granger tried to argue, but the facts were undeniable. The board was forced to back down, rescind the fines, and issue a formal apology. The crowd that had once watched us with suspicion now applauded, some even coming up to shake our hands and offer congratulations. But the victory was bittersweet. The sense of community that had once made Maplewood Estates feel like home was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of mistrust. Some neighbors still avoided us, others quietly thanked us for standing up to the board. The trees remained, but the scars of the battle would take time to heal. Just when we thought it was over, another letter arrived, this one threatening further action if we didn't comply with all HOA directives. It was clear that Mr. Granger wasn't finished with us yet. The fight for our home and our peace of mind was far from over. And as I stood in my yard, looking at the trees we'd fought so hard to protect, I couldn't help but wonder, how far would the HOA go to get their way, and how much more were we willing to risk to defend what was ours? The day of the final showdown arrived with a heaviness that settled over our house like a storm cloud. I woke up before dawn, unable to sleep, my mind racing with everything that had happened, the threats, the fines, the isolation, the endless letters. Sarah moved quietly through the kitchen, making coffee with trembling hands, while Ethan sat at the table, silent and pale, pushing his cereal around his bowl. Even the dog seemed to sense the tension, packing restlessly from room to room. We knew what was coming. The HOA had scheduled an emergency board meeting to address our continued non-compliance and obstruction. The letter made it clear, if we didn't agree to their demands, they would move forward with legal action, including a lien on our home and possible forced removal of the trees, maybe even us. The threat was no longer just about landscaping. It was about our right to live in peace, to feel safe in our own home. As the sun rose, I gathered every document, every survey, every letter and email into a thick folder. Our attorney, Ms. Patel, met us at the door, her face set with determination. "We're not backing down," she said, her voice steady. "They're counting on you to be afraid, but you have the law on your side now." The community center was already crowded when we arrived. Neighbors filled the folding chairs, some whispering, others staring straight ahead. At the front of the room, the HOA board sat behind a long table, Mr. Granger in the center, his expression cold and unyielding. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart pound. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but it was clear this was no ordinary gathering. Mr. Granger wasted no time, launching into a speech about the importance of order and the dangers of individual defiance. He waved a stack of papers in the air, copies of our fines, the letters, the so-called evidence of our violations. His voice grew louder, more strident, as he accused us of undermining the community and setting a dangerous precedent. I felt the eyes of the room on me, some sympathetic, others hostile. My hands shook as I stood to speak, but I forced myself to meet Mr. Granger's gaze. I laid out the facts, how we followed every rule, how the surveyor's report proved the trees were on our property, how the county's own records backed us up. I handed copies of the documents to each board member, my voice growing stronger with every word. Ms. Patel stood beside me, calm and precise, explaining the legal ramifications of the HOA's actions. She pointed out the outdated maps, the discrepancies in the board's records, the threats and intimidation tactics. She made it clear that if the board continued down this path, they would be facing a lawsuit, not just from us, but potentially from other homeowners who had been bullied into silence. The room grew quiet. Even Mr. Granger seemed to falter, his bluster fading as the weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. One of the board members, a woman who had always seemed uncomfortable with the conflict, spoke up. "I think we need to reconsider," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't keep doing this to people." But Mr. Granger wasn't ready to give up. He slammed his fist on the table, insisting that the integrity of the HOA was at stake. He accused us of manipulating the system, of trying to turn the neighborhood against him. His face was red, his voice shaking with anger. "If we let them win," he shouted, "what's to stop everyone else from breaking the rules?" At that moment, something shifted in the room. A neighbor I barely knew, a quiet man who lived 2 houses down, stood up. "Maybe the problem isn't the rules," he said softly. "Maybe the problem is how they're enforced." Another neighbor, then another, began to speak out. Stories tumbled out about fines for garden gnomes, for kids' bikes left on the lawn, for holiday decorations that didn't match the HOA's color scheme. The room filled with voices, frustration and anger bubbling to the surface after years of silence. Mr. Granger tried to regain control, but the tide had turned. The board members looked at each other, uncertainty in their eyes. Ms. Patel pressed the advantage, reminding them that the law was clear, that the HOA could not override property rights or use intimidation to enforce arbitrary rules. She warned that if they continued, we would file a lawsuit and that the evidence would be public record. Finally, the board called for a vote. One by one, the members raised their hands, first the woman who had spoken up, then the others, until only Mr. Granger remained, his hand clenched on the table. The motion passed. The fines would be rescinded, the trees would stay, and the board would review its enforcement policies with input from the community. The room erupted in applause. Sarah burst into tears, relief and exhaustion washing over her. Ethan hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Neighbors came up to shake our hands, to thank us for standing up, to apologize for not speaking out sooner. For the first time in months, I felt the weight begin to lift. But as the meeting ended and people began to file out, Mr. Granger remained at the table, his face pale and drawn. He glared at me, his voice low and bitter. "This isn't over," he muttered. "You've made a lot of enemies today." I looked at him, feeling a strange mix of pity and anger. "Maybe it's time things changed," I said quietly, "for everyone." As we walked out into the cool night air, the sense of victory was tempered by the knowledge that the fight had taken its toll. Our home was safe, for now, but the scars of the battle would linger. The community had spoken, but the question remained, would the changes last, or would old habits return once the dust settled? The answer, I realized, would depend on what happened next, and whether anyone else would have the courage to stand up when the next fight came. In the days after the board meeting, the air in Maplewood Estates felt different, lighter, but also uncertain, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. For the first time in months, I woke up without that familiar knot of dread in my stomach. The sun streamed through the kitchen window, and Sarah actually smiled as she poured her coffee, her shoulders no longer hunched with worry. Ethan, sensing the change, was back outside before breakfast, kicking his soccer ball across the yard, his laughter echoing down the street. It was as if a storm had finally passed, leaving behind a fragile peace. But the scars of the battle were still there, just beneath the surface. The trees we'd fought so hard to protect stood tall and green, their leaves rustling in the morning breeze, but I couldn't look at them without remembering the threats, the fines, the sleepless nights. The mailbox, once a source of anxiety, now brought only the usual bills and junk mail, but every time I opened it, I half expected another letter from the HOA. The fear didn't vanish overnight. It lingered, a reminder of how quickly things could change. Sarah and I spent long evenings on the porch, talking about everything we'd been through. We realized how much we'd lost, time, energy, peace of mind, but also how much we'd gained. We learned to stand up for ourselves, to trust our instincts, to fight for what mattered. We discovered strength we didn't know we had, and we'd found allies in unexpected places. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now stopped to chat, offering words of support or sharing their own stories of run-ins with the HOA. Some even brought over homemade cookies or fresh vegetables from their gardens, small gestures that meant more than they could know. The board, shaken by the public backlash and the legal threat, moved quickly to repair its image. Within a week, they sent out a letter to every homeowner, announcing a review of all enforcement policies and inviting residents to participate in a series of open forums. For the first time, the community was given a real voice. People showed up in record numbers, eager to share their frustrations and ideas. The meetings were sometimes heated, but they were honest, and for the first time, it felt like the board was actually listening. Mr. Granger, the once untouchable president, was noticeably absent from most of these gatherings. Rumor had it he was considering stepping down, though he never made a public announcement. The rest of the board, perhaps sensing the shift in the wind, became more transparent, publishing meeting minutes and responding to questions in a timely manner. The fines that had once been handed out so freely were now rare, reserved for only the most serious violations. The board even created a new committee, made up of regular homeowners, to review any future disputes before action was taken. The changes didn't happen overnight, and not everyone was happy. There were still a few who grumbled about troublemakers and softening standards, but the majority seemed relieved. The sense of fear that had once hung over the neighborhood began to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism. People started decorating their yards again, planting flowers, hanging wind chimes, letting their kids leave bikes on the lawn without worrying about a citation. The community, once fractured by suspicion and resentment, slowly began to heal. For our family, the impact was profound. The anxiety that had haunted our home was replaced by a quiet pride. We stood up to the board and won, but more importantly, we'd shown Ethan what it meant to fight for what's right. He asked more questions now, wanted to know about rules and fairness, about why some people abused power and how others could stop them. We talked openly about what had happened, about the importance of standing together, about the difference one voice can make. The trees, once a source of conflict, became a symbol of resilience. Every time I looked at them, I remembered the nights spent poring over documents, the fear of losing our home, the relief when the board finally backed down. I remembered the neighbors who had spoken up, the attorney who had fought for us, the strangers who had sent messages of support. I realized that our story wasn't unique, that all over the country, families were facing the same battles, the same threats, the same abuse of power. And I realized that by telling our story, by refusing to be silenced, we'd become part of something bigger. The story spread beyond Maplewood Estates. Local news outlets picked it up, running headlines about homeowner stands up to HOA and wins. I was invited to speak at a city council meeting where I urged leaders to review HOA regulations and protect homeowners from overreach. Other families reached out, sharing their own stories, asking for advice, offering solidarity. It was humbling and a little overwhelming to realize how many people were struggling with the same issues. But the most important change was closer to home. Our relationships with our neighbors deepened. We started hosting barbecues again, inviting old friends and new faces alike. The kids played together in the street, their laughter a reminder of what we'd almost lost. The sense of community that had once drawn us to Maplewood Estates was back, stronger than before, forged in the fire of shared struggle. Of course, there were still challenges. The board was still there, and the rules hadn't disappeared. But now, there was a sense of balance, of accountability. People felt empowered to speak up, to question decisions, to demand fairness. The fear that had once kept everyone silent was gone, replaced by a sense of ownership and pride. Looking back, I realized that the real victory wasn't just keeping our trees or avoiding a lien on our home. The real victory was reclaiming our sense of agency, our right to belong, our belief that ordinary people can make a difference. We faced down a system designed to intimidate and control, and we'd come out stronger on the other side. Sometimes late at night, I'd walk out to the yard and stand beneath the trees, listening to the wind in the leaves. I'd think about everything we'd been through, the fear, the anger, the exhaustion, and I'd feel a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for the outcome, but for the journey, for the lessons learned, for the community we'd helped rebuild. The story of our fight with the HOA became a kind of legend in Maplewood Estates, a cautionary tale and a rallying cry. New families moving in would hear about it, and some would come by to ask for advice or just to say hello. I always told them the same thing: don't be afraid to stand up for what's right. Don't let anyone make you feel powerless in your own home. And remember, you're not alone. As the seasons changed and the years passed, the trees grew taller, their roots deeper, their branches reaching for the sky. They became a living reminder of what we'd fought for, not just a patch of land, but a place to call home, a community worth protecting, a future worth believing in. And so, if you ever find yourself facing an unfair rule, a petty authority, or a challenge that seems too big to overcome, remember our story. Remember that change is possible, that courage is contagious, that one voice can inspire many. The fight may be hard, the cost may be high, but the reward, the chance to live with dignity, to belong, to make a difference, is worth every struggle. What would you risk to protect your home, your family, your community? And what kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? Sometimes, all it takes is the courage to say enough, and the willingness to stand your ground, no matter the odds.